Some memories are meant to stay buried, but the deepest ones have a way of clawing back to the surface. The fluorescent lights of Seattle General's trauma bay hummed their familiar tune as Dr. Elena Vasquez sutured her third gunshot wound of the night. Outside, November rain hammered the windows like restless fingers, and the city seemed to pulse with an energy she couldn't name. She prided herself on her steady hands, her clinical detachment, her ability to save lives without getting emotionally involved. But when the paramedics wheeled in the man with the pale skin and the knowing smile, everything changed. He was dying. That much was clear from the massive blood loss and the monitor's erratic beeping. Yet his eyes held a strange calm, almost amusement, as if death was merely an inconvenience. As Elena worked to stabilize him, he reached up with surprising strength and gripped her wrist. "You'd remember a night with me," he whispered, his voice carrying an accent she couldn't place. Elena looked down at him, her medical training warring with something deeper, something that felt like recognition. Her reply would haunt her for the rest of her life, because somehow, impossibly, she knew exactly what to say. But what could a respected surgeon possibly remember about a man she'd never met? "Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you." Elena's lips parted, and the words emerged without conscious thought, as if pulled from some hidden chamber of her mind. "I remember the taste of wine and moonlight on your lips." The man's eyes widened, not with surprise, but with satisfaction. His grip on her wrist tightened for one impossible moment, and then his hand fell away as the monitor flatlined. "What the hell?" Elena stumbled backward, her pulse hammering against her throat. The trauma bay erupted into controlled chaos around her as the team initiated resuscitation protocols, but she stood frozen, staring at the stranger's face. Wine and moonlight? She didn't drink wine. She'd never said anything like that in her life. "Dr. Vasquez!" Nurse Patricia Chen's sharp voice cut through her fog. "We need you here, now." Elena forced herself back into motion, her hands moving through the familiar choreography of emergency medicine. Compressions, defibrillation, epinephrine. But even as she fought to bring him back, she knew it was futile. Whatever had been keeping him alive until this moment had simply stopped. They called it at 3:47 a.m. Patricia pulled the sheet over the man's face while Elena stripped off her blood-soaked gloves, her hands trembling slightly. In 12 years of emergency medicine, she'd seen hundreds of deaths. None had ever affected her like this. "You okay, Doc?" Patricia's concern was evident. "You look like you've seen a ghost, just tired." Elena's voice sounded hollow even to her own ears. "Who was he? Did the paramedics say anything?" "John Doe. Found in an alley downtown with multiple stab wounds." Patricia lowered her voice. "But Detective Morrison's here asking questions. Word is they think it might be connected to those missing persons cases." The collector. Elena had read about the serial killer in the news like everyone else. 7 people vanished over the past 6 months, all found days later alive, but empty. Victims who couldn't remember their own names, let alone what had happened to them. The media had dubbed the perpetrator the collector because it seemed like their memories had been harvested, leaving behind breathing shells. She glanced back at the covered body. Had she just watched a monster die? Then why did she feel like she'd lost something precious? "Dr. Vasquez?" Detective Sarah Morrison approached, badge visible on her rain-soaked jacket. "I understand you were treating the victim. Did he say anything before he died?" Elena hesitated, her medical training warring with an instinct she couldn't name. He was mostly unconscious. The injuries were too severe for meaningful conversation. The lie came too easily, which unsettled her more than the truth would have. Morrison nodded, scribbling in her notepad. "We'll need his personal effects for evidence. Not much, just a silver ring and some kind of antique pendant." "Of course." Elena signed the required paperwork with mechanical precision, but her mind kept replaying those final moments. The way he'd looked at her, the certainty in his voice, the impossible familiarity of her own response. By the time her shift ended at 7 a.m., the rain had softened to a persistent drizzle that turned Seattle's streets into a watercolor painting. Elena sat in her car in the hospital parking garage, key in hand but unable to start the engine. Exhaustion pulled at her bones, but sleep felt impossible. She drove home through empty streets, her Capitol Hill apartment building emerging from the grey dawn like something from a dream. The Victorian conversion had character, her real estate agent had said, but this morning its ornate details seemed almost sinister in the half-light. Her one-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor was exactly as she'd left it, surgical journals stacked on the coffee table, yesterday's scrubs in the hamper, her grandmother's old trunk serving as a makeshift end table. Everything normal, everything rational. So why did the familiar space feel foreign? Elena made coffee with shaking hands and settled into her reading chair, hoping routine would restore her equilibrium. But when she closed her eyes, she saw stone corridors lit by torchlight, heard the whisper of silk against skin, felt the weight of a crown she'd never worn. Wine and moonlight. The phrase echoed in her mind like a half-remembered song. She'd spoken those words with absolute conviction, as if accessing a memory that belonged to her completely. But Dr. Elena Vasquez didn't have romantic encounters with mysterious strangers. She had medical conferences and research papers and a carefully ordered life built on facts and evidence. She pulled out her laptop and typed the patient's description into the missing persons database, though she wasn't sure what she hoped to find. No matches, no identity, just a dead man who'd spoken to her like an old lover and somehow made her respond in kind. Outside her window, Seattle continued its morning routine, commuters emerging like sleepwalkers, coffee shops lighting up, the city slowly awakening. But Elena felt disconnected from it all, as if she were viewing the world through someone else's eyes. She needed sleep, needed to forget this night had ever happened. But as she finally drifted off in her chair, she couldn't shake the feeling that forgetting might no longer be an option. The jarring buzz of her phone pulled Elena from restless sleep 3 hours later. She jerked awake in her reading chair, neck stiff and laptop sliding from her lap. The coffee had gone cold, leaving a bitter film on her tongue that somehow reminded her of copper pennies. "Dr. Vasquez? It's Dr. Kim." Her department chief's voice carried its usual crisp authority. "I know you just finished a double, but we need you back tonight. Rodriguez called in sick, and we're already understaffed." Elena rubbed her eyes, trying to focus on the familiar demands of her carefully structured life. "Of course, I'll be there." "Good. Also, there's been some interest from the research committee about your memory disorders study. They want to discuss expanded funding at Thursday's meeting." The irony wasn't lost on her. For 2 years, she'd been documenting cases of traumatic memory loss, trying to understand how the brain processed and stored experiences. Her work with the collector's victims had been groundbreaking, 7 people who'd lost not just memories, but their essential sense of self. She'd written papers on it, presented at conferences, built her reputation on understanding the inexplicable. Now she was living it. After Kim hung up, Elena forced herself through the motions of a normal day. Shower, check emails, review case notes. But normalcy felt like a costume that no longer fit properly. When she reached for her shampoo, she found herself expecting the weight of long hair that hadn't been hers since medical school. When she opened her refrigerator, she craved foods she'd never tasted, rich stews and dark bread and wine that sang on the tongue. Her reflection in the bathroom mirror looked wrong too. Same dark eyes, same olive skin inherited from her Mexican grandmother, same efficient ponytail. But there was something else there now, a depth that hadn't existed yesterday. As if someone else was looking out through her pupils. The thought sent ice through her veins. Elena threw herself into research, but even her sanctuary, the systematic pursuit of medical knowledge, felt contaminated. She pulled up her files on the collector's victims, studying their brain scans and psychological profiles with new urgency. Maria Santos, 28, found after 3 days missing with complete retrograde amnesia. David Chen, 34, discovered in Discovery Park unable to remember his wife's name. 7 cases of impossible memory loss. 7 lives hollowed out and refilled with nothing. But what if it wasn't nothing? What if something else had taken up residence in those empty spaces? Her laptop screen reflected her grandmother's trunk behind her, and Elena found herself turning to stare at the old wooden chest. Abuela Rosa had died when Elena was 15, leaving behind mysterious stories about old countries and older magic. Elena had dismissed those tales as folklore, symptoms of aging and nostalgia. But now she remembered Rosa's warnings about memories that didn't belong, about the ways the past could bleed through and claim the present. Superstitious nonsense, Elena had always thought. But Rosa had been a curandera before immigrating, a traditional healer who'd believed in things that couldn't be measured or explained. Elena's phone buzzed with a text from her sister, Carmen. "Coffee tomorrow? Haven't seen you in weeks." The invitation should have brought comfort. Carmen represented everything stable in Elena's world: marriage, children, a neat suburban life in Bellevue that followed predictable patterns. Sunday dinners, birthday parties, holiday traditions that anchored them both to who they'd always been. But the thought of sitting across from Carmen now filled Elena with inexplicable dread. Her sister knew her too well, would notice the changes immediately. How could Elena explain that she felt like a stranger in her own skin, that she kept expecting to see stone walls instead of drywall, to hear different voices speaking foreign words? She texted back, "Rain check?" Crazy week at hospital. Another lie. They were accumulating like scar tissue. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Elena found herself walking through Pike Place Market, though she couldn't remember deciding to leave her apartment. The familiar chaos of vendors and tourists should have been comforting, but instead she felt exposed, as if everyone could see the fault lines spreading through her carefully constructed identity. She stopped at her usual coffee cart, where Miguel always had her order ready: medium dark roast, no sugar. But when he handed her the cup, she found herself asking, "Do you have anything richer, stronger?" He looked puzzled. "Been making your coffee the same way for 2 years, Doc." 2 years. Such a small span compared to what felt like lifetimes of other memories pressing against her consciousness. Elena forced a smile and accepted her usual order, but the coffee tasted like ash. Walking back to her car, she caught her reflection in a shop window and stopped cold. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw someone else looking back, a woman with the same features but different eyes, wearing clothes that belonged to another century entirely. When she blinked, it was just Elena again. Dr. Elena Vasquez, neurosurgeon, researcher, woman of science. But as she drove toward another night shift, she couldn't escape the growing certainty that the person she'd been yesterday was slipping away, being slowly overwritten by someone else's story. The call came through dispatch at 11:47 p.m., just as Elena was reviewing charts in the break room. Multiple trauma incoming. ETA 4 minutes. Victim found at the old Fairmont Hotel construction site. Elena's hands stilled on her paperwork. The Fairmont had been abandoned for decades, a Gothic shell of Seattle's gilded past that developers had finally decided to renovate. She'd driven past it countless times, never giving it much thought. So why did her pulse quicken at the mention of its name? She was still puzzling over her reaction when the ambulance doors burst open. The paramedic's voice cut through the trauma bay's controlled chaos. 23-year-old female. Found unconscious in the hotel basement. No obvious injuries, but she's been missing for 6 days. Elena's blood turned to ice water. 6 days. The collector's pattern. Sarah Mitchell. The paramedic continued as they transferred the victim to the gurney. Her roommate filed the missing persons report last week. But as Elena approached the patient, the world seemed to tilt sideways. The young woman's face was hauntingly familiar, not because Elena had seen her before, but because she looked exactly like the woman Elena had glimpsed in the shop window reflection. The same delicate bone structure, the same full lips, even the same way her dark hair fell across her forehead. "Sarah, can you hear me?" Elena's voice sounded distant to her own ears as she began the examination. Standard protocols, familiar routines, but her hands trembled as she checked pupil response and vital signs. The woman's eyes fluttered open, Green eyes, nothing like Elena's brown ones, but when they focused on Elena's face, recognition blazed there like a struck match. "Milady," Sarah whispered, her voice carrying an accent that belonged to no modern place. "You've returned to us at last." The words hit Elena like a physical blow. Around them, the medical team continued their assessment, but Elena felt frozen in place. Sarah's hand found hers with impossible strength, fingers interlacing as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. "The journals," Sarah continued, her grip tightening. "He said you'd have the journals." Rosa's bloodline remembers, even when the rest forgets. Elena's grandmother's name in this stranger's mouth sent shockwaves through her nervous system. "What are you talking about? How do you know? Dr. Vasquez?" Nurse Patricia's voice cut through Elena's spiraling thoughts. "We need to run the standard memory assessment." But before Elena could respond, Sarah's eyes rolled back and she began to convulse. Not a seizure. Elena had seen hundreds of those. This was something else entirely, as if multiple consciousnesses were fighting for control of one body. During the thrashing, Sarah's hospital gown shifted, revealing an intricate tattoo that covered her left shoulder. Elena's breath caught. She knew that design, a serpentine dragon wrapped around a crown of thorns. She'd sketched it herself in the margins of notebooks during boring lectures, drawn it obsessively since childhood, though she'd never gotten the tattoo. How was that possible? "Sedate her," Elena ordered, but her voice cracked on the words. As the medication took effect and Sarah's movements stilled, Elena found herself leaning closer. "The trunk," Sarah murmured, her words barely audible. "The trunk holds the truth. But beware, milady. Once you open that door, there's no closing it again. He's been waiting so long for you to remember who you really are." Then Sarah was unconscious, leaving Elena standing there with her world fracturing around her. "Doc?" Patricia was studying her with concern. "You look like you're about to collapse." Elena forced herself to step back, to resume the role of composed physician. But inside, everything was screaming. Rosa's bloodline, the journals, the trunk that had sat in her apartment for nearly 20 years, used as nothing more than furniture. 3 hours later, Elena sat in her car in the hospital parking garage, staring at her hands. They looked the same as always, but she could swear she felt the phantom weight of rings she'd never worn, could almost see the impression of jewels that had never graced her fingers. The choice stretched before her like a chasm. She could go home, make her normal coffee, review her normal case files, pretend this night had never happened, continue being Dr. Elena Vasquez, rational woman of science, and ignore the growing certainty that she was becoming someone else entirely. Or she could open her grandmother's trunk. Elena started the engine, her decision already made. As she drove through Seattle's rain-soaked streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was finally heading toward answers she'd been avoiding her entire life. Behind her, in the rearview mirror, the hospital's lights grew smaller. Ahead, her apartment waited in the darkness, along with a wooden chest full of secrets that might explain why a dying stranger had looked at her with love, and why his victim had called her by a title that belonged to someone else entirely. Elena sat in her car outside her apartment building for 20 minutes, engine running, watching the rain streak down her windshield. The familiar burgundy Victorian loomed before her, but it felt different now, not like coming home, but like approaching a threshold she might not be able to cross back over. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white. Everything rational in her screamed to drive away, to check into a hotel, catch a flight to somewhere warm and logical, where mysterious patients didn't call her by titles that made her blood sing with recognition, where dying strangers didn't whisper ancient words that unlocked memories she'd never lived. But Sarah Mitchell's voice echoed in her mind. Rosa's bloodline remembers. Elena finally forced herself out of the car, each step toward the building feeling weighted with inevitability. In the lobby, she nearly turned back 3 times. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor felt endless, and her key trembled in the lock as if her own body was rebelling against what she was about to do. Her apartment greeted her with oppressive familiarity. Same cream-colored walls, same carefully chosen furniture, Same medical journals stacked with obsessive precision. Everything exactly as she'd left it that morning, when she'd still been certain of who she was. The trunk sat in the corner where it had always been, draped with a throw blanket and supporting a reading lamp. Perfectly mundane. Just furniture inherited from a grandmother who'd told too many stories about old magic and older memories. Elena made coffee first, then tea, then reorganized her already pristine kitchen. Anything to avoid confronting the wooden chest that suddenly seemed to pulse with dark promise. She checked her email, reviewed patient files, even started organizing her closet by color. But every time she looked toward the living room, the trunk seemed larger, more significant, as if it were waiting. What if there's nothing there? She thought desperately. What if I open it and find normal things? Old photographs, costume jewelry, mothballs and disappointment. What if I'm losing my mind over nothing more than exhaustion and stress? The possibility should have been comforting. Instead, it terrified her almost as much as the alternative. Because if the trunk contained only ordinary relics, then she truly was going insane. She was a neurosurgeon experiencing elaborate hallucinations, hearing voices, losing herself to delusions that felt more real than her own life. She thought about calling Carmen, confessing everything to her sister's practical wisdom. Carmen would drive over immediately, would hold her while she cried, would probably insist on taking her to psychiatry for evaluation. Carmen would save her from whatever this was. Elena's finger hovered over her sister's contact for a full minute before she set the phone aside. She couldn't drag Carmen into this, whatever this was. Couldn't risk contaminating her sister's safe, suburban world with the chaos spreading through her own. The coffee had grown cold again. Elena found herself standing in front of her bathroom mirror, studying her reflection for signs of madness. Same tired eyes, same worry lines earned through years of life-or-death decisions. But underneath the familiar features, something else looked back at her. Something that whispered in a voice not quite her own. You know who you are. You've always known. She thought about her medical career, 12 years of saving lives and advancing human knowledge. Her research into memory disorders had earned recognition, respect, a sense of purpose that had sustained her through the loneliness and sacrifice. If she opened that trunk, if she surrendered to whatever was pulling her toward it, what would happen to Dr. Elena Vasquez? The woman who'd spent her 20s in medical school while her friends dated and married, who'd chosen the graveyard shift because healing felt like a sacred trust, who'd built her entire identity around being rational, scientific, grounded in observable reality. He's been waiting so long for you to remember who you really are. Sarah's words cut through her spiraling thoughts like a blade. Elena pressed her palms against the marble countertop, trying to anchor herself in the present moment. But even the solid stone felt insubstantial now, as if everything she'd thought permanent was just painted scenery that might collapse at the slightest touch. The trunk waited in the next room, holding answers that might destroy everything she'd worked to become. Or might finally explain why she'd never felt quite real, why success tasted hollow, why she'd spent 34 years feeling like an actor playing a role that didn't quite fit. Elena looked at her reflection one more time, memorizing the face of the woman she'd been. Then she walked into the living room, pulled the throw blanket away from her grandmother's chest, and knelt before the brass latches that had remained closed for 2 decades. Her hands shook as she reached for the first latch. Behind her, Seattle's rain continued its endless percussion against the windows, and somewhere in the darkness, Elena felt certain that someone, or something, was waiting to see what she would choose. The first latch clicked open with a sound like breaking bone. Elena's breath caught, but she forced herself to continue. The second latch resisted, brass green with age, until it finally surrendered with a reluctant snap. The trunk's lid lifted on hinges that groaned like something waking from a decades-long sleep. The scent hit her immediately. Sandalwood and dried roses, old paper and something else. Something metallic and dark that made her mouth water with inexplicable hunger. Elena's hands trembled as she stared into the trunk's shadowed interior, paralyzed between desire and terror. There's still time to stop, she thought frantically. close the lid, walk away, pretend none of this happened. But even as the thoughts formed, she knew they were lies. There was no walking away from this. There never had been. The first item she lifted was a leather journal, its cover worn soft with handling. Elena's heart hammered against her ribs as she opened to the first page, written in her grandmother's careful script. For my granddaughter, Elena, when the time comes for remembering. I pray it never will, but the bloodline carries its own inevitability. Elena's vision blurred. She blinked hard, forcing herself to focus on the next lines. The memories are not madness, Mia. They are inheritance. What I could not escape, I pray you will find the strength to embrace, or to end forever. The journal slipped from Elena's nerveless fingers as the room tilted around her. Rosa had known. Had known this would happen. Had written these words decades ago while Elena was still a child playing with toy stethoscopes and dreaming of saving lives. She reached into the trunk again, her movements mechanical now, beyond conscious choice. Her fingers closed around something smooth and cold, a hand mirror with an ornate silver handle. When she lifted it, the reflection that looked back wasn't entirely her own. The face was Elena's, but the eyes belonged to someone who had seen centuries pass, who had loved and lost and ruled from shadows, someone who remembered the weight of a crown and the taste of power absolute. No, Elena whispered, but her voice sounded strange, richer, carrying an accent that belonged to no place on any modern map. This isn't real. This can't be real. But her hands were already reaching deeper into the trunk, pulling out item after item as if guided by muscle memory that predated her birth. A circlet of black metal set with stones that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, parchments covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly but somehow made perfect sense. And beneath it all, wrapped in velvet the color of old blood, a dagger whose blade sang with barely contained darkness. Elena's fingers traced the dagger's edge, and knowledge flooded through her like water through a broken dam. Not human knowledge, something older, hungrier, the memories of a woman who had ruled from a castle of shadows, who had commanded loyalty through fear and love in equal measure, who had danced through ballrooms while kingdoms rose and fell around her. Lady Elisaveta Dracul, the vampire king's consort, his equal in darkness, his partner in the endless waltz between predator and prey. The name settled into Elena's consciousness like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known existed. Every strange moment of the past few days suddenly crystallized into terrible clarity, the recognition in Matthias's dying eyes, Sarah's reverence, the growing sense that her own life was just a thin veneer over something infinitely more complex. She had been Elisaveta once, not in some metaphorical sense, not symbolically, but literally. The memories weren't invading, they were returning home. Elena, Elisaveta, laughed, and the sound held notes of hysteria and relief, and something that might have been madness. All those years of feeling incomplete, of sensing that something crucial was missing from her carefully ordered existence. She hadn't been going crazy. She had been remembering. The trunk held more, journals spanning decades, photographs of people who should have been dead but weren't, letters written in Matthias's familiar hand across centuries of separation, evidence of a love story that transcended death itself, of a connection that not even rebirth could fully sever. But beneath the wonder came terror so pure it nearly stopped her heart. Because if she was Elisaveta, if these memories were real, then she wasn't human. Had never been human, despite 34 years of believing otherwise. The life she'd built, the career she'd fought for, the careful construction of Dr. Elena Vasquez, all of it was just an elaborate costume, worn by someone pretending to be mortal. And Matthias was awake somewhere in the city, had been trying to find her, to reclaim what they'd once shared. The collector's victims, the impossible memory transfers, it had all been him, searching for a way to restore what she'd lost. Elena sank back on her heels, the weight of 2 lifetimes pressing against her skull like a migraine made of starlight and shadow. The apartment around her felt absurdly small now, a dollhouse compared to the vast halls she remembered ruling. The modern world seemed thin as tissue paper, barely concealing the darkness that pulsed beneath its surface. There was no going back. The woman who had entered this apartment tonight was gone, replaced by something far older and infinitely more dangerous. The trunk had been her chrysalis, and what emerged was neither fully Elena nor completely Elizaveta, but something new, something that remembered, the taste of eternity and the weight of a crown. Outside, Seattle slept on, unaware that one of its most dangerous residents had just awakened. The city held its breath around her, but Elena could feel it watching now. Every shadow seemed deeper, every pool of streetlight more isolated. The Seattle she'd known for 12 years was still there, but it was like looking at a familiar photograph and suddenly noticing figures lurking in the background that had always been invisible before. She rose from the scattered contents of the trunk, her movements fluid in a way that felt both foreign and utterly natural. The dagger's weight in her hand was perfect, balanced for someone who had once needed to kill swiftly and silently. The circlet called to her from its velvet wrapping, but she wasn't ready for that, not yet. Some transformations required ceremony. Her phone buzzed against the coffee table, the sound jarring in the supernatural stillness. A text from the hospital emergency surgery needed. "Dr. Patterson requests you come in immediately." Elena stared at the message, and for a moment, the two halves of her existence warred violently. Dr. Elena Vasquez, who had sworn to do no harm, who saved lives in sterile operating rooms under fluorescent lights, and Lady Elizaveta, who remembered the sweetness of blood on her tongue and the intoxicating rush of absolute power. But before she could respond, her apartment door exploded inward. 3 figures moved through the splintered wood with inhuman speed. Not vampires. Elena's newly awakened senses would have recognized them immediately. These were something else, hunters. Their black tactical gear bore symbols that made her inherited memories recoil. Crosses wrapped in silver wire, holy water in specialized grenades, weapons blessed by priests who understood exactly what they were fighting. "Lady Elizaveta," the lead hunter spoke, his voice distorted by a voice modulator that scraped against her supernatural hearing like nails on glass. "By order of the sacred hunt, you will come with us." Elena's laugh surprised everyone in the room, including herself. It was Elizaveta's laugh, rich and dangerous and completely unafraid. "I've been awake for exactly 20 minutes, and you've already found me. Someone's been very patient." The hunter's weapon, some hybrid of crossbow and rifle that reeked of blessed silver, tracked her movement as she stepped away from the trunk. The awakening sends ripples. Ancient things stirring always draw attention. "You have a choice, come willingly, or we take you." I've heard that before. The words spilled out before Elena could stop them, carrying the weight of centuries-old defiance. It didn't end well for the last group that tried. But even as bravado filled her voice, Elena's mind raced with terrible clarity. She was caught between 2 worlds, too human still to access her full supernatural abilities, too awakened to pass for mortal. The hunters knew exactly when to strike, when she'd be most vulnerable. One of them raised a device that looked like a tablet crossed with an EMF detector. Confirmed awakening, but incomplete integration. Memory cascade still in progress. We can extract her without triggering a full manifestation. Extract. The word sent ice through Elena's veins because she understood what it meant. These weren't just hunters, they were collectors. They wanted to tear the awakening memories from her mind, leave her as an empty shell, neither Elena nor Elizaveta, but something broken and hollow. "You can try," she said quietly, and felt the dagger's blade sing with anticipation. The lead hunter tensed, recognizing the shift in her voice. "Elena Vasquez, you are still human enough to choose. Don't let the parasite memories override your real life. We can save you from this." For a heartbeat, Elena almost believed him, almost saw salvation in their offer, to cut away the darkness spreading through her thoughts like ink through water. She could go back to the hospital, perform the surgery, continue saving lives in clean, rational ways. But then she remembered Matthias's eyes in that alley, the recognition that had blazed between them. Sarah Mitchell calling her "Milady" with such genuine reverence. The feeling of finally being complete after 34 years of inexplicable emptiness. "My choice," Elena said, and her voice carried harmonics that hadn't existed in her throat an hour ago, "is to remember everything you've tried so hard to make me forget." The hunters moved as one, but Elena was already in motion. Not with her clumsy human reflexes, but with muscle memory that belonged to someone who had survived centuries of similar attacks. The dagger found the first hunter's throat before he could fire, while her other hand sent his tablet crashing into the wall. The remaining 2 hunters fell back, regrouping with military precision. One spoke rapidly into a throat mic, awakening accelerated by contact with original artifacts. "Request immediate extraction team." Elena smiled, and it was a predator's expression. "Tell me," she said conversationally, pulling the silver bolt from her shoulder where the second hunter's shot had grazed her. "Does Matthias know you're here? Because he's going to be very unhappy when he finds out you interrupted our reunion." The hunters exchanged glances, and Elena caught the fear that flickered beneath their professional composure. Good. Let them remember why their predecessors had failed for centuries to end what she and Matthias had built together. Outside, Seattle's rain continued to fall, but now Elena could hear other things moving in the darkness. The city's supernatural underground, responding to the ripples of her awakening. Some would be allies, drawn by old loyalties that transcended death itself. Others would be enemies, eager to claim the power vacuum her long absence had created. But all of them would soon learn that Lady Elisaveta Dracul had returned, and she was no longer content to hide behind mortal masquerade. The remaining hunters backed toward the shattered doorway, their weapons trained on her with professional steadiness that couldn't quite hide their fear. Elena let them retreat, savoring the shift in power dynamics. She could hear their extraction team moving through the building, heavy boots on stairs, the metallic click of weapons being readied, whispered coordinates through encrypted channels. 12 minutes out, the hunter with the throat mic reported, never taking his eyes off her. Target is fully combat capable but still transitioning. Window for clean extraction closing rapidly. Elena tilted her head, studying them with newfound predatory interest. 12 minutes? That's optimistic. She stepped over the fallen hunter's body, noting how they flinched at her casual dismissal of their colleague's death. "Tell me, how long have you been watching me?" "Months? Years?" The lead hunter's finger tightened on his trigger. "Since your grandmother's funeral. We knew the bloodline carried markers, but you seemed so normal. Medical career, no supernatural contacts, completely integrated into human society. We almost classified you as a recessive." Almost. Elena's laugh carried dangerous harmonics. "But you kept watching anyway, just in case Dr. Elena Vasquez wasn't as human as she appeared." Her phone buzzed again, another message from the hospital. The normal world, demanding her attention even as everything she'd built there crumbled around her. For a moment, Elena felt a stab of genuine grief for the life she was leaving behind. Her patients who trusted her steady hands, her research that might have helped others understand the mysteries of memory, the clean simplicity of a world where death could be fought with science instead of embraced as power. But that grief lasted only seconds, before being overwhelmed by something infinitely larger. The memories weren't just returning now, they were integrating. Elena felt her consciousness expanding beyond the narrow confines of a single human lifetime, embracing centuries of experience that made her medical career seem like a brief, quaint experiment. She had been a queen once, had commanded armies and brokered treaties between the human world and the creatures that hunted in its shadows, had danced at court while kings begged for her favor, had whispered in languages that predated written history. And Matthias, she could feel him now, somewhere in the city's supernatural underground, not just alive butt hunting. The collector murders hadn't been random, they'd been a desperate search, each stolen memory analyzed for traces of her consciousness. He'd been looking for her for decades, probably longer, following bloodline markers and inherited traits across generations of her family. "Where is he?" she asked the hunters conversationally. "You know I can feel him now, don't you? The awakening creates a resonance between us. He'll know exactly where I am within the hour." "Matthias Dracul died 3 nights ago," the lead hunter said, but uncertainty flickered in his voice. "The collector was terminated during attempted extraction. You felt the echo of his death. That's what triggered your awakening sequence." Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut. "Did he? Because I'm sensing something very much alive moving through Pioneer Square right now. Something old and patient and furious about being hunted through his own city." The hunters exchanged glances, and she caught the moment their confidence cracked. Whatever intelligence they'd been operating on was incomplete. They'd expected to find a confused, newly awakened woman struggling with foreign memories. Instead, they'd walked into a trap set by someone who remembered exactly how to use confusion as a weapon. The building's lights flickered, then died completely. Emergency power kicked in seconds later, but in that brief darkness, Elena heard something that made her inherited memories sing with recognition. The flutter of massive wings against rain-soaked air. "He's coming," she whispered, and couldn't keep the anticipation from her voice. "You might want to call for more backup." One of the hunters pressed his throat mic urgently. "Contact lost with perimeter teams. Repeat, contact lost with all perimeter units. Request immediate." The building shook as something heavy landed on the roof. Not helicopter heavy, something that moved with organic purpose, that set the entire structure resonating like a struck bell. Elena closed her eyes and felt Matthias's presence wash over her like dark water. Rage and relief and desperate love all tangled together in a psychic signature that made her knees weak. He'd found her. After however many years of searching, of stolen memories and calculated murders, he'd finally found her. When she opened her eyes again, they held flecks of crimson that hadn't been there moments before. "Gentlemen," she said softly, "I suggest you run. Because when my king discovers what you've done to his city, to his people, looking for me—" She smiled, showing teeth that were just slightly too sharp. "Well, the Vampire King has never been known for his mercy." The hunter's weapons swung toward the ceiling as heavy footsteps began moving overhead, but Elena was already reaching for the circlet in its velvet wrapping. Some reunions, she decided, required proper ceremony after all. The circlet was heavier than it looked, the black metal warming under Elena's touch, as if responding to her proximity. The moment it settled onto her brow, the world shifted. Not visually. The apartment still surrounded her with its modern banality, but dimensionally, as if reality had suddenly acquired depth she'd never perceived. The hunters were shouting into their communications, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. Elena could hear Matthias moving overhead with predatory patience, and beneath that, the whispered conversations of every supernatural creature within a 5-mile radius. Seattle's hidden world was awakening around them like a vast organism, responding to her presence. "My queen." His voice reached her before he did, sliding through the building's structure with impossible intimacy, not spoken aloud, transmitted directly into her consciousness through bonds that had survived death itself. The sound of it nearly brought her to her knees. "I felt you die," she responded without speaking, her thoughts finding the channel between them as naturally as breathing. "Felt your memories scatter into nothing. How are you?" Later. The promise in that single word made her shiver. "First, we deal with the insects who dared hunt in my city." The ceiling above them buckled, then tore apart like wet paper. Matthias dropped through the opening with fluid grace, landing in a crouch that spoke of centuries perfecting the art of controlled violence. He rose slowly, deliberately, giving the hunters time to truly understand what they faced. Elena's breath caught. Even with Elisavetta's memories flooding back, seeing him again was like being struck by lightning. He looked exactly as she remembered and completely different, still tall and lean and deadly, but wearing modern clothes that somehow made him more alien rather than less. A predator's attempt at camouflage, that only emphasized how little he belonged in this sanitized world. But it was his eyes that stopped her heart. Ancient beyond measure, dark as winter nights, and focused on her with such desperate hunger that she felt it like a physical touch. Elizaveta. Her name on his lips was prayer and curse and promise all at once. The hunters opened fire. Elena moved without conscious thought, the circlet's weight centering her as muscle memory older than nations took control. She flowed between the silver bullets like water, her stolen dagger finding throats and hearts with surgical precision. These weren't the clumsy movements of Dr. Elena Vasquez. This was Lady Elizaveta in all her lethal glory. Matthias was a blur of controlled savagery beside her, and Elena felt a sick joy at how perfectly they moved together. Centuries apart, but their combat rhythm was as synchronized as breathing. They had danced this dance through countless battles, and death hadn't diminished their deadly partnership. When the last hunter fell, Elena found herself pressed against the far wall, chest heaving with exertion that felt more like ecstasy. Matthias stood among the bodies, not even breathing hard, his dark eyes drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst. "You remember," he said softly. "I remember everything." Her voice cracked on the words. "The castle, the court, the night we—" She stopped, overwhelmed by the intensity of memories that felt both ancient and immediate. "But I also remember this life. 12 years of medical school, every surgery I've performed, every patient I've saved. I'm both of them, Matthias. I don't know how to be both of them." He moved toward her with careful deliberation, as if approaching something infinitely precious and equally fragile. "You don't have to choose. Elena made you strong in ways Elizaveta never was. Mortal experience has given you perspective we lacked in our first life." "Our first life ended badly," Elena whispered, because she could remember that too now. The betrayal, the separation, the agony of being torn from everything she'd ever known. "How do we know this time will be different?" Matthias stopped just close enough to touch, his hands hovering near her face, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. "Because this time, we understand what we're fighting for." Outside, sirens wailed in the distance. The normal world was responding to the chaos, sending police and paramedics and investigators who would find only ordinary violence in an apartment that had just witnessed the resurrection of a supernatural dynasty. Elena looked at the bodies around them, then at her hands still gripping the ancient dagger. "There's no going back, is there? Dr. Vasquez is gone." "Not gone," Matthias said gently. "Transformed. The woman who saves lives and the queen who commands death, both are you. Both are necessary for what comes next." "What comes next?" His smile was sharp as winter wind. "We reclaim our kingdom. But first—" He finally allowed himself to touch her face, his fingers tracing the line of the circlet with reverent precision. "First, we remember what we are to each other." The kiss that followed tasted like coming home and falling into darkness all at once. The kiss shattered when the apartment's windows exploded inward. Elena spun away from Matthias as figures in tactical gear repelled through the openings, their movements precise and coordinated. Not the clumsy hunters from before, these were something else entirely. Their weapons gleamed with more than silver, inscribed with symbols that made her newly awakened senses recoil. "Extraction team," the lead figure announced, voice mechanically distorted. "Lady Elizaveta, by order of the Covenant Council, you are bound for immediate containment." Matthias snarled, fangs extending, but froze when red laser dots painted his chest from 6 different angles. Impossible. "The council was disbanded centuries ago. Reformed," the leader said coldly. "Some threats require resurrection of old methods." Elena felt reality shift around them as the symbols on their weapons began to glow. Not just blessed silver, these were binding weapons, designed to trap supernatural entities rather than destroy them. She could feel the net of energy they were weaving, invisible chains that would hold even creatures of their power. "Matthias," she whispered, reaching for him. "Don't." His voice was sharp with panic she'd never heard before. "The binding ritual. If we're touching when it completes, it will trap us both permanently." The betrayal hit her like physical blow. After centuries of separation, they had found each other for exactly 37 minutes before the world conspired to tear them apart again. Elena felt Elizaveta's rage surge through her, ancient and volcanic, but Dr. Vasquez's analytical mind was already cataloguing their options. None of them were good. The awakening was premature. One of the tactical team reported into his comm. Integration incomplete. Both subjects show psychological fragmentation. We can exploit the identity confusion. Elena's phone buzzed insistently. Without thinking, she glanced at the screen. Another message from Seattle General. Dr. Peterson, her colleague, texting frantically about a patient in crisis. A 7-year-old girl with a traumatic brain injury whose surgery Elena was supposed to perform in 3 hours. She's seizing again. Where are you? We need you now. The words hit her like a slap. While she'd been playing at remembering ancient royalty, a child was dying. A child whose life depended on Dr. Elena Vasquez's steady hands and precise knowledge, not Lady Elizaveta's deadly grace. You see it now, the team leader said, following her gaze to the phone. The human life you're abandoning. How many patients will die while you chase these parasitic memories? How many children will suffer because you chose fantasy over responsibility? Elena's grip on the dagger wavered. The circlet felt suddenly heavy, foreign, like wearing someone else's skin. She could save that little girl, could return to the hospital, continue the work that actually mattered, help people in ways that were real and immediate and good. But Matthias... She looked at him and saw her own anguish reflected in his eyes. Centuries of searching, and now the choice between love and duty was tearing them apart from the inside. Elena. His voice was soft, resigned. Choose the child. The words broke her heart because she heard the truth in them. He understood. The man who had burned cities to find her was telling her to walk away because even he could see that Dr. Elena Vasquez saved lives while Lady Elizaveta only took them. The binding won't hold me forever, he continued quietly. But that little girl, she doesn't have time for our supernatural drama. One of the tactical team stepped closer, extending what looked like a collar made of inscribed metal. Dr. Vasquez, you can end this now. The suppressant will sever your connection to the parasitic memories permanently. You'll forget this night, forget him, forget everything except your real life. You can be back at the hospital in an hour. Elena stared at the collar, then at Matthias, then at her phone where Dr. Peterson's messages were becoming increasingly desperate. The child was coding. Without immediate surgery, she would die while Elena played at being a vampire queen in an apartment full of corpses. I'm sorry, she whispered, and wasn't sure if she was speaking to Matthias, to Elizaveta's memory, or to herself. She reached for the collar. The metal was cold against her fingers, but the moment she touched it, agony shot through her skull. Not physical pain, something deeper. The sound of memories being torn away, centuries of experience dissolving like sugar in rain. She could feel Elizaveta screaming as she faded, could feel the connection to Matthias stretching thin as gossamer. Elena. No. Matthias lunged forward despite the laser sights, but the binding field caught him mid-step, freezing him in place like an insect in amber. She looked at him through tears she didn't remember shedding, already feeling the memories slip away. His face was becoming unfamiliar again. Just another stranger in a world that suddenly made terrible, rational sense. Dr. Elena Vasquez had a surgery to perform. The collar closed around her throat with a sound like breaking glass.